Now when it comes to the design of EZGUI, the Windows API is so rich with so many different commands and features. Actually, it's more like API functions. You got messages and so forth that are sent to Windows or controls. It's kind of hard to know where to start. And so I made the decision when I first started developing this library, and then eventually the first commercial version of EZGUI, ask myself, what would the average programmer need? So every program has a menu, right? Drop-down menus and so forth. Well, I needed certain basic menu commands. You know, every program uses the basic controls like a button control, radio or option button, a combo box, list box, and so forth. So you started with there. And then when I look at each control, there's a lot of things you can do with a control. And actually, amazingly, when you look at the Windows API, it's surprising how many messages, for example, a specific control, especially the more complex ones like list view and tree view support. And so it can be a little overwhelming. So I would ask myself, well, would most programmers need this? And if I figured, well, if 1 out of 100 might use this feature, that could be left for later. And I would concentrate on the features or the actions or tasks. I like to use the word tasks because I would look at it from a point of view of not so much an API, but a task. How do you, for example, how do you fill a list box with items? How do you delete an item? And I would look at those tasks and I'd say, okay, well, how many programmers, say out of 100 would normally need this or require this task in their application? So if I said a large percentage or a majority, then that would be one of the first things that I would put into the runtime engine. So as time went on, this project, like I said, this was an in-house tool, eventually became a commercial project, just ballooned and just continued to grow. I got to the point where something else was missing. And in the first version of EZGUI, as I was developing it, remember, the primary product is a GUI engine. It's a DLL with hundreds of commands in there to do all the user interface stuff. Well, other programming languages use a visual designer of some kind. And to be truthful, it's not too easy to design your own visual designer from scratch using the Windows API. So I said, well, I need a rudimentary designer. And in all honesty, EZGUI version 1, the designer was, compared to today's standards, was really quite pitiful. But it worked, and it generated solid code, and the code that it generated worked. So while it was minimal, it did the job. But I made a really good decision in that first version of EZGUI. I asked myself, I says, well, when I design my visual designer, which is like my primary application created with my library, or EZGUI library or runtime, well, out of every feature that I need in a designer, I should put it in the runtime, because I put so much effort into learning the Windows API to figure out how to accomplish something in a designer. I'm sure other people would like those features in their application. So I made the decision that whatever went into the designer, that had to be a feature built into the runtime engine, so that my customers could do the same thing I did, that they could build a designer just like I did. And while admittedly the first version of EZGUI, the designer was very, very rough, very rudimentary, it did work, and it did some basic drag and drop. It was kind of weak in some areas. For example, the first designer didn't even have drag handles. I used the edges of the control, and then the cursor would change and you drag it. It was a little funny, but it worked. But as I began to develop version 2, I started going beyond some of these simple things. And by the time I got to version 3 was probably one of the major implementations of EZGUI. That's when it really, in my personal opinion, became a high-quality commercial product. And while the designer was still a little behind, remember, everything that the designer did were features, at least the basic functionality of it was something in the runtime engine. So I added, for example, my own drag-handled control, so now I could easily implement drag handles. Now, anyone who uses EZGUI for their own development, they can easily create drag handles. It's very easy, no complexity to it whatsoever. Well, EZGUI 4 was really the first time I decided I really need to concentrate more on the visual designer. And while, believe it or not, the command set increased significantly in EZGUI 4, I also did a lot of improvements in the visual designer. And while I'm not going to say that the EZGUI 4.0 professional designer is the best designer out there and so forth, it's a little weak in a few areas. I'm not afraid to admit that. But it does the job. It's designed to work with the EZGUI runtime library, and it generates solid code. And it uses a thing called a smart parser that I built into it that really allows you to use any external code editor that you like as long as it's compatible with it. Well, the beauty of EZGUI 4.0 though is that the runtime engine really developed and blossomed into what? It's a powerhouse, it really is. And some people may not appreciate this, but there's a number of aspects about EZGUI 4.0 of why a person would want to use it. Well, true, there's a learning curve. Like any product, any programming tool, there's a learning curve. EZGUI 4 has a learning curve too. But once you really understand the basics and how it works and how you can write your applications, you'll find some interesting things about EZGUI 4.0. The first thing is, well, I would say this existed in the product from version 1 onward. As they continue to develop EZGUI, you remember, I'm continuing to add more and more advanced features in every version. And the more advanced the features, the more complex they get. And so, the more complex code gets, the greater chance of there being bugs in it or errors. And one of the things I'm very proud of as an individual is that EZGUI, and no one in the world can say their software is 100% bug-free. I think as humans, it's not possible to do that. But I really do try to go for a 99.9% bug-free if I possibly can. Rock-solid code, tested over and over again. I don't use a normal beta program in testing the software. I have a system called a pre-release, where I basically release the product early as I'm continuing to add more features to it. And while some may view that, well, it's a beta, okay? If you were to ask my customers who have used those pre-release versions, very rarely have they had to report bugs. I mean, maybe once in a blue moon there would be one, but most of the time that process, that development cycle, was geared toward getting suggestions to add new features and expanding on the existing feature set, rather than going back and finding bugs in the software. Why? Because I do a lot of testing in-house myself. I like my software to be bug-free, solid as a rock. Just to give an example, I designed a software application for a local business. It was a small mom-and-pop lumber store, and they have 2 stores today. And this company, I designed basically a full-blown accounting program that did all their accounts receivables is the term, and it handled all their bills of sale and everything like that. Well, this DOS application was created, I think, in 1990, mid-90s somewhere. Do you realize that that company is still using my DOS applications today, 15 years later? It tells you something. One is easy to use, reliable, solid as a rock. And so, why change? I asked the customer, why haven't you gravitated to something new, more modern? If it works, why change it? Why fix it? Well, it's because I've always believed in a good programmer must be a good debugger. You must know how to test your own software. You must know how to make your software solid as a rock. And that's an art. It really is. It's not something that's easily taught in school. It's something that I think some people are just gifted and have the ability to analyze their own software, look for bugs. And I consider that very, very important. So when programmers used EZGUI, they've got a runtime library that's solid as a rock, reliable,